There's a moment during a traffic stop that most people never think about until it's too late. It's not when the lights come on. It's not when the officer walks up to your window. It's the exact second your brain decides whether to speak or stay silent. Because in one real case, a man made a decision that looked strange to everyone watching. He said nothing, not a single unnecessary word, and by the time everything was over, that decision didn't just end the traffic stop. It changed his life in a way most drivers wouldn't even believe. Before we get into that, I want to ask you something honestly. If a police officer pulled you over tonight and started asking questions, would you feel comfortable staying completely silent except for what is legally required? Think about that carefully and drop your answer in the comments. Most people say they would stay calm and say less, but in reality, when the pressure hits, they start talking almost instantly. And that difference between what we think we'll do and what we actually do is exactly where things begin to go wrong. Now here's where the story gets interesting. Most drivers believe that talking helps them. They think explaining, apologizing, or being overly cooperative will make the situation easier, and sometimes it does. But sometimes, that same instinct creates problems that didn't exist before. The man I'm talking about understood something most drivers never fully grasp. He understood that during a traffic stop, every word you say becomes part of the situation, whether you intend it to or not. Picture this scenario clearly. A vehicle is pulled over on a quiet road. The officer approaches, just like any routine stop. From the outside, nothing looks unusual. The driver hands over his documents when asked. He doesn't argue, he doesn't resist, he doesn't act aggressively. But something feels different. The officer begins asking questions. Normal questions. Where are you coming from? Where are you headed? Do you know why you were stopped? The driver doesn't engage in conversation beyond what is required. He doesn't guess, he doesn't explain, he doesn't fill the silence. To most people watching, that might seem strange, even suspicious, because we're used to conversation, we're used to explaining ourselves. But here's what that driver understood. Silence, when used correctly, isn't weakness, it's control. Now let's pause for a second and break down what's actually happening during a traffic stop from a legal perspective, because this is where most people misunderstand the situation completely. When an officer stops a vehicle, they are allowed to do so based on reasonable suspicion that a traffic law was violated. That gives them the authority to temporarily detain the vehicle and investigate. During that time, the driver is required to provide certain information. Typically, that includes a driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance. Those are legal requirements. But beyond that, the conversation often moves into a different category. Questions like where you're going, what you were doing earlier, or whether you know why you were stopped are often part of the officer's investigation, but they are not always legally required for you to answer in detail. And this is where most drivers make a critical mistake. They treat every question as if it must be answered fully, immediately, and with as much detail as possible. Why? Because silence feels uncomfortable. Silence feels like you're doing something wrong, even when you're not, so people talk. They explain, they apologize, they guess, they try to be helpful, and without realizing it, they begin building a narrative that the officer can use to shape the rest of the stop. Now go back to that driver who stayed silent. What he avoided was not just saying the wrong thing, he avoided giving the situation more material than it needed. Think about how many traffic stops escalate simply because of conversation. A driver says they were in a hurry. That confirms speeding. A driver mentions they had a drink earlier. That introduces the possibility of impairment. A driver gives inconsistent answers about where they were. That raises suspicion. None of these things automatically mean the driver is guilty of something serious, but each one adds a layer to the situation, and layers lead to deeper investigations. What the silent driver did was remove those layers. He kept the interaction limited to what was necessary. Now here's the part most people don't think about. Officers are trained to observe behavior. Not just what you say, but how you say it. They watch your hands, they watch your eyes, they listen to your tone. They're also trained to gather information through conversation. That doesn't mean they're trying to trick you. It means they're doing their job, which includes understanding what's happening during the stop. But when a driver talks freely, they often provide more information than the officer could have gathered just by observation. And that information can change everything. Now, let's address something important because this is where people often misunderstand the idea of staying silent. Staying silent does not mean being disrespectful. It does not mean refusing lawful orders. It does not mean turning the situation into a confrontation. The driver in this case remained calm. He complied with what was required. He simply chose not to engage in unnecessary conversation. There's a big difference between silence and hostility, and officers can usually tell the difference. Now you might be wondering, how does this lead to someone walking away with a massive outcome, something as extreme as becoming a millionaire? Here's where the story takes a turn most people don't expect. In certain situations, when a traffic stop goes beyond its legal limits or when rights are violated, the consequences can extend far beyond a simple ticket. If an officer detains someone longer than legally allowed without proper justification, or conducts a search without valid legal grounds, that can become a serious issue. And in some cases, those issues end up in court. Now imagine a situation where a driver has said very little. No admissions, no conflicting statements, no extra details. Everything about the encounter is based on what the officer did, not what the driver said. That creates a very clean record of the interaction, and in legal terms, clarity matters. Because when a case is reviewed, every detail is examined. What was the reason for the stop? How long did it last? What justified each step of the investigation? If something doesn't align with legal standards, it can lead to consequences for the department involved. Settlements, lawsuits, and legal judgments can sometimes reach very high amounts depending on the situation. Now, to be clear, not every traffic stop leads to anything like that. Most end quietly, with a warning or a citation, but the principle remains important. What you say during a traffic stop can either strengthen your position or weaken it, and most drivers weaken their position without realizing it. Let's bring this back to something practical you can actually use. Imagine you're pulled over tomorrow. The officer approaches and asks, "Do you know why I stopped you?" Instead of guessing or apologizing immediately, you respond calmly, "I'm not sure, officer." That single sentence keeps the situation neutral. Now the officer explains the reason. You listen, you provide your documents. If more questions come, you keep your answers simple and respectful without volunteering extra information. You don't argue on the side of the road. You don't try to prove your case in that moment. You allow the process to play out the way it's designed to. And that's the real takeaway most people miss. Traffic stops are not conversations where the driver wins by saying more. They are structured interactions where clarity, calm behavior, and understanding your role make the biggest difference. Because sometimes the smartest move isn't finding the perfect thing to say. It's knowing exactly when saying less gives you more control over what happens next.